Welcome to Class 16 for Hebrew 1 and 2, Bright Old Testament 500. Today we're going to be looking at the Niphal stem, the second of 7 stems in Hebrew. We've already looked at the Kal stem, but we looked at the Kal stem over a period of 3 weeks. Today we'll be covering the entire Niphal stem in one lesson. That's because all the information that we learned in the Kal stem has prepared you for the following 6 stems. The prefixes in the imperfect as well as the occasional suffix, and the suffix in the perfect are the same in the Niphal, as well as several of the other patterns. All we have to do is change everything to the stem of the Niphal. This is far more easy than you may suspect, which is why we're going to cover this in one lesson. So let's get started. The pronunciation key for the Niphal is exactly as it sounds, Niphal. However, to put it into the katal form that we've been using, this is niktal. Remembering that kal is katal, we still have a patak under the second root letter, but now we have a nun and a hirik as a prefix, Niphal. The key to Niphal then is the ni. The translation is most often reflexive or passive. However, as we've already discussed, this is not always the case, but it's at least a good place to start. This is the complete verbal paradigm for the Niphal perfect strong verb. We've included the katal on the left-hand side for comparison. You'll notice that these are almost identical, except that the nun with the hirik gives away what exactly is going on. This is a Niphal. Niphals are very convenient because in the perfect, in the participle, and in at least one form of the infinitive absolute, the nun of the Niphal is actually written, so you will see it. Niktal, niktal, niktol. Again, ni is the key to the Niphal. In certain forms of the Niphal stem, including the imperfect, the imperative, and one form of the infinitive absolute, the nun of the Niphal is not actually written. Instead, it is represented by a dagesh in the first root letter. Of course, as we have already discussed, the dagesh in the first root letter is not actually the nun. It is that first root letter that is doubled, so as to maintain the short hirik vowel under the preformative. This allows that first syllable to be a closed syllable, therefore keeping the short vowel. However, for the sake of memory, it's often easier to think of that dagesh as being the nun. That way you remember that this is still a Niphal and not a Kal. This is the complete paradigm for the Niphal strong imperfect verb. You'll notice that the giveaway is the hirik plus a dagesh plus the komets under the first root letter. There is no other verb form that has a komets under the first root letter in the imperfect form. This is the giveaway for the Niphal. So Niphal becomes yi'afel, having a seireh as the second root letter instead of the holum that we see in the Kal. So instead of yiktol, we have yikatel. Again, the pattern is a hirik plus a dagesh plus a komets plus a seireh. This makes this verb form easily recognizable. The imperative is formed the exact same way as the imperative in the Kal stem. The preformative letter is dropped off. However, in the Niphal, another letter is added in, and that letter is a he. So a he is a giveaway of the imperative in the Niphal stem. In the Niphal stem, in the infinitive construct and the infinitive absolute, it is possible and common to have a he prefix, just like in the imperative. However, just like in the imperative, the vowel pointing will mimic that of the imperfect, the hirik followed by the komets followed by a seireh, with a dagesh forte in the first root letter. This is true in the infinitive construct. In the infinitive absolute, the sign of the infinitive absolute is always a holum vav, so instead of a seireh, there will be a holum vav after the komets under the first root letter with the dagesh. Although also in the infinitive absolute, it is possible to have a nun prefix, which is expected since this is the Niphal. Again, the holum vav demonstrates that we are in the infinitive absolute. Either of these patterns is possible in the infinitive absolute, but both of them should be recognizable as a Niphal. The Niphal participle is very similar to the Niphal strong verb. It's niktal. However, instead of having a patak under the second root letter, there is a komets, niktal. Here is the entire verb paradigm for the Niphal stem. You'll notice that there is no passive participle because the Niphal itself is passive. You'll also notice that the nun of the Niphal exists in the perfect and the participle and in some forms of the infinitive absolute, but not in the other forms, although in all the other forms it is represented by a dagesh in the first root letter. There's also a he prefix in the imperative, the infinitive construct, and the infinitive absolute. The imperfect does not have the he, but there is still a hierarch followed by the dagesh followed by the komets, a vowel pattern that gives away exactly what stem this is. Because of the pointing of the Niphal stem, there are some identical forms. The Niphal perfect 3fs and the Niphal participle feminine singular are exactly the same. That is because the patak under the tate in the Niphal perfect has become a silent schwa, followed by the komets he. The Niphal participle does the same. Another identical form is the Niphal imperative masculine singular and the Niphal infinitive construct, both of which have the he prefix, the hierarch plus the dagesh forte in the first root letter, with the komets under the first root letter, followed by a seirei. These will be an issue in parsing, however, context and actual translation will tell you which is in mind. Here are some potentially confused forms. The Niphal perfect 3ms is niktal. The Cal imperfect 1cp also has a nun prefix, although you will notice it is niktol, because yiktol is the form of the perfect. The Niphal participle masculine singular is niktal. However, you will notice that the patak is lengthened to a komets, which is a giveaway differentiating the Niphal perfect 3ms from the Niphal participle ms. Really, the secret is to memorize the second vowel. In the Cal imperfect, it is a holum stem vowel. In the Niphal perfect, it is a patak, and in the Niphal participle, it is a komets. There are weak verbs in the Niphal stem just as there are in the Cal stem. However, the weak verbs in the Niphal stem create nowhere near as much trouble as they do in the Cal stem. For instance, this chart represents the third aleph verbs, and I've included the Niphal strong verb paradigm at the bottom of this slide for comparison. You'll notice the only difference is the presence of a komets under the second root letter in the 3ms perfect. That's because the aleph prefers the komets rather than the patak. And this is only an issue because it makes the perfect 3ms look like the participle masculine singular at the other end of the chart. Again, context will tell you which is in mind. But really, third aleph verbs do not cause any sort of problem within the Niphal stem. Third he verbs also do not really cause that big of an issue within the Niphal stem. The only real issue is that occasionally the he will drop, which is why they're in gray on this particular chart. You'll notice, though, as you scan down the list, there are not really any major changes. There is a komets under the second root letter in the perfect 3ms, again because he is technically a guttural, and gutturals prefer that komets rather than a patak in the second root letter. In the 2ms, where the tav komets has been added as the 2ms subject marker, the he has dropped and become a yod, and there is a seirei as the connecting vowel, which again is the same just as the Cal verb. In the imperfect, again, the he prefers the segol, which is true across all stems. In the imperative and in the infinitive absolute, version 2, that segol has become a seirei, which again is not unexpected. The infinitive construct has an ot, holum vav tav, as though the he was a feminine ending, and the participle again has a segol. The holum vav under the infinitive absolute has instead become simply a holum, as the vav drops out before the he. But again, all of these patterns are expected because the Cal third he verbs do the exact same. On the one hand, third he verbs are quite annoying because the he drops out. On the other hand, third he verbs are great because the vowel of the third he demonstrates which form we're in. For instance, a perfect in this case 3ms, third hey verb will always have a comments. An imperfect third hey verb will always have segol. An imperative third hey verb will always have sere. An infinitive construct will always have holum vav tav, and a participle will always have segol. Always. Whether you're in the cal or the Niphal, the PL, the HIF-PIL, it doesn't matter. The hey will always take the same vowels in its various forms. As is to be expected, gutturals again cause some problems within the Niphal stem, although you will notice if you glance at this chart that the only real issue is the guttural in the first root letter, preferring a compound schwa rather than a vocal schwa. Because the guttural does not take a dagesh, when the nun would have assimilated into that first root letter as a dagesh forte, the dagesh is rejected and the first root letter becomes a lengthened form of the previous vowel. Thus we have sere. However, an E or I class vowel, either a sere or a hirik yod, immediately followed by a comments, is still a giveaway for the Niphal, fail. This comments under the first root letter is the easiest way to tell that we are dealing with a Niphal. First nun verbs are occasionally a problem because there's already a nun and now we're adding another nun in the Niphal stem. However, the way this is accommodated is simply putting a dagesh forte into the second root letter. Again, not the first root letter because the first root letter is a nun. Instead, the dagesh forte goes in the second root letter, at least in the perfect and the participle. This is because the nun has assimilated into the second root letter and the first nun has dropped. The nun that you see here is actually the nun of the Niphal. In the imperfect, the imperative, the infinitive construct, and infinitive absolute, the verb looks exactly the same because there's already a nun being placed in the first root letter as a dagesh forte, and we simply maintain the same here in a one nun verb. So again, the dagesh forte in the perfect and the participle is really the only difference within first nun verbs. Historically speaking, first yod verbs are not really first yod verbs, but first vav verbs. However, it's awkward to start a verb with a vav, so the vav has over time become a yod. When, however, we add things to the front of a first yod verb, the yod goes back to being a vav, and then the vav becomes either a holum vav or acts as a consonant. That's why in the perfect and the participle you see a holum vav. That's the yod that has become a vowel alongside the nun. In the imperfect, the imperative, and the infinitive construct, the vav acts as a vav, as a full consonant. That is not shurik, although it looks that way. That is a vav with a dagesh forte. So two vavs. One vav closing out the hirik of the previous syllable, another vav having the vowel that is found underneath. Again, this is very easy to see because we don't expect to have a holum vav immediately after a nun. For those of you who like to see all the pieces together, here is the complete Niphal stem paradigm of the strong and weak verbs in all of its forms. Again, the important part to notice is that there is a nun prefix in the perfect and the participle. There is a hirik followed by a dagesh forte followed by a comments in the imperfect, the imperative, the infinitive construct, and in some forms the infinitive absolute. There's also a hey prefix in the imperative, the infinitive construct, in some forms the infinitive absolute. In the infinitive absolute, we still have holum vav as the indicator that we're in the infinitive absolute. Again, the Niphal stem is quite simple compared to the cal because there are so many things to use to diagnose which stem we're in. That preformative vowel immediately followed by a comments is a dead giveaway, as well as the nun or the dagesh forte representing the nun in that second root letter. Again, simply familiarize yourself with this chart. You do not need to memorize it. Simply become aware of the fact that you find heys and in which stem you find them, and the vowel pattern and in which stem you find them. Well, that's the end of our lesson. Hopefully you have not been overwhelmed by the Niphal stem. It's quite simple. far less information to memorize than in the cal stem, which is ironic because nothing's actually happening in the cal stem. But in the Niphal stem, the nun is always a giveaway of the fact that you're in a Niphal stem. So, use Quizlet, memorize your vocabulary, and I will see you in class.